Hello and welcome to The Wise Wire. This morning I am joined by an amazing, insightful, powerful woman called Philippa Smithhurst. I met Philippa when she came to me and asked me for some help for some back-end stuff on her YouTube channel, and I was blown away by the subject matter of her book. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I am a advocate and a champion for people who have gone through trauma, but as usual, The Wise Wire is not about me. It is about my guest. So over to you, Philippa. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, and thank you so much for your help with the YouTube, which took it to a completely different level. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm Philippa Smethurst. I'm 30 years a trauma psychotherapist, and I've just written a book on trauma, which was published yesterday. That's me. I've been interested in trauma because I've been interested in people for a very long time. And trauma really is when a great big boulder comes into your pond and all of the water is displaced and everything is changed from then on. So trauma changes us. And I'm fascinated, which is why I've written the book, about how and why those changes show up. That's it,
and
really.
It's an amazing book. And this is, anyone who knows me knows I'm a child of trauma. I come through for various different reasons, which is why when you came to me, I absolutely adored your book, because I'm one of the lucky people. I've been and seen someone like you. I've done a lot of personal work on myself, but I know a lot of people are scared, and I know that it's a fear, and I totally get it because I used to be there. And I wondered if you could just explain why you wrote the book, but also what holds people back from coming and actually seeking the help and support from someone like you.
Yeah, well, I think when trauma happens, I've got a bottle of Coke over there with fizz in it. And that fizz that comes up in the fizzy bottle of Coke is what happens in trauma very often. So we get kind of overwhelmed by, yes, fear, but hormones and energy, and it comes up us. And what happens to that fizz? Well, that's the problem. Really, it needs to be discharged. But instead of that, it tends to we constrict, and sometimes that charge also means that we get very, very taken up by being like a hamster on a wheel, and we can't get off that hamster. All of that fear and all of that constriction, all that response to the trauma charge is because we've been hurt. And we've been hurt at the very core of us very often. Something awful has happened. And our bodies do this charge business to protect us from more pain. So our bodies and minds are trying to help us actually survive. But the trouble is the survival bit starts to have a life of its own. So I think that's why people get scared, Kirsty, because it's such strange and confusing. We know that we're not the same. We know we have to keep on doing what we're doing. That's what the body and mind tells us to do. We trot around down the same little paths. We have a different perception of ourselves, different beliefs about ourselves and the world. But it's very hard to think about how to be any different. So that's why I wrote, because I thought, well, there are things that we can do. We can discharge, we can understand trauma, we can stand back, we can compassionately and with curiosity try to understand what it is that's happening to us inside. Might need some help with that, might need some specialist help, might not though. We can do a lot of self-help to discharge and to slow down and to use our breath. There are lots of resources that we can use. So that's I think why we get scared.
And that brings us on to the book, because your book, now I've had the privilege of reading it, and thank you, because wow, and I will say, there were points in it where I went, oh, that's close. Oh, but what I really loved was the poetry at the end of each chapter. I thought that was really, really, I mean, you've got to read the book just to see it, but it's also the practical tips. Yeah. I once read Twisted Fables for Twisted Minds by the Barefoot Doctor, and that book changed my life. Reading your book reminded me very much of that book and how it completely changed my life. And I can honestly say anyone who is whether they think they're going through trauma or they're not sure, or they've got somebody that they think is traumatized for any reason, go and get Philippa's book. And I'm going to put the ticker tape on now. I'm going to put it on a few times just so people can actually see where to go and get it. And as we're talking, I wondered if you could just explain more about the structure of your book and how you wrote it to help people.
Sure, absolutely. So the idea started in the first lockdown. So when we had that existential threat coming towards us, we all responded in such different ways. Some people were very anxious, washing lemons and thinking the pandemic was in the paving stones, and other people were disregarding completely and thinking there was no threat. So I thought, this is really interesting. Let's lay down some of the common trauma responses. Now, we've all heard of fight and flight and freeze. Now, these are some of these defensive survival responses that I was talking about. There's also quite a lot more, and they went to 20. So we've got fight, flight, freeze. We've got the flop. Now, that's a very interesting thing. So if you're overwhelmed sometimes, the whole body with the parasympathetic nervous system takes over, and you faint, you go under the radar. It can be very dramatic, like I just described, or it can be just that you can't get off the sofa. And it's nothing to do with a choice. It's to do with your body protecting you, like animals in the savannah, as they're approached by a lion. It's the last ditch attempt, if you like, to survive. So that's an interesting one, that flopping down under the radar. Then there's a thing called disconnect. The very official word for it is dissociation, which isn't very well understood. But basically, dissociation means we don't associate with the bad thing. So a gulf happens between us and the bad thing, and we're on the other side of it. So how that shows up is that we might feel very like we're looking at the world through plate glass, very numb, cut off, unable to feel anything, in a kind of emotional fog. And folk listening to this might recognize this. It's almost like you've lost your feelings, and you feel sometimes really bad about that, which is another chapter in the book, because very often these trauma symptoms, even though we don't mean to or want to, we feel to blame for what's happened to us. So I heard a man the other day talk about his brother who committed suicide. Terrible grief, but they didn't feel the grief. He felt for years guilty. And that's a deep down response to bad things. It particularly happens in childhood, in fact. Children end up feeling to blame, and they're full of shame. And that shame is another response that we have as well. The other responses, and there's chapters 13 to 17 are really about these, are when our relationships with others are affected. So trauma, with this whoosh that I spoke about, so takes us over that we cut our threads to the world, to ourselves and our feelings, but also to other people, because those people might be the ones that are being involved in traumatizing us. We might need those people very much, but we might also be scared of them. And that's a real double bind. So we might have a slight aura of need about us, want to be close to somebody else, but not know how to make those connections. Or we might come on really quickly and latch on and then push somebody away. The push-pull. Sometimes I think it's a bit like Dr. Dolittle, with the animal pushing at two ends at once. You can have that kind of thing going on. And if you don't understand that it's because of somebody's trauma history, you might judge them or give up on them. But these are things that happen as a result of trauma. Of course, other chapters in the book are more about how this pain, this wound that we have really, really hurts us and breaks our hearts. And that we might be so involved with doing these trauma responses that we don't get to the painful heart. And the painful heart might be at the heart of everything. And sometimes, of course, we're so in the pain and so wounded that we can't see anybody else's pain. And you might see situations around the world that are rather like that in a global sense. People are full up with their own pain and they can't see anybody else's. They're locked in. And another chapter in the book is about how we get caught up like in a whirlwind on a destructive cycle with fear and survival and doing the same thing, getting more and more out of control. And things can go very badly downhill with destructive cycles. And if you're around somebody who's in a destructive cycle, if they're a member of your family, that's really tricky because you want to love them, you want to care for them, but you feel powerless to stop them hurting themselves. It's very difficult. I've put quite a lot in the book about how you might be alongside somebody who's in a destructive cycle. One thing that's going to backfire, logic. If you apply logic, it's a gun that often backfires on itself and makes the person more entrenched. So that's one thing that doesn't work. But kind, calm, being alongside and noticing that the person is in pain, being consistent, believing in them, and allowing them to say what they might need. A great question is, what could you do right now just to feel a little bit better? How can I help you with that?
That's absolutely brilliant. And what I will say is, as I said earlier on, I was very lucky. I sought out help. I got the help. And then reading your book from the perspective of someone who's had help, but has also had friends who've had mental health breakdowns. I've had friends who have been in that destructive cycle. The shame for me is something that I see a lot, that shame and that guilt. Your book helps me and allows me to take a step back. And instead of having my own response to a situation, sometimes it allows me to take that step back, take that breath, and actually go, okay. And I'm doing this with my own daughter currently at the moment, where we're going through we've had a big change, a massive change. And in that massive change, we've gone through a trauma response because she's had a loss and now she's moving to the new thing. She doesn't deal with change and all of those things. And I will say thank you, because your book has helped me. And that's the thing. People always assume that trauma is a big thing. Yeah. They also assume that it's got to be dramatic, but it's not, is it?
No, it can be very, very subtle. Very subtle, and we don't even know we're being traumatized. We might notice that somebody's eyes just move away a little bit. It can be very subtle as well as dramatic. I love the fact that you're helping your daughter. You know, in the first chapter of the book, I talk about breathing, and breathing is trauma first aid. I mean, I just think it is. And what we can do is use our breath to take that step back, like you say, Kirsty. It's so wonderful. And a great trick, and I can even do it now on the thing if you want me to, is to slightly lengthen the out breath. Should I do it now?
Yeah, do it. This is what this is about.
Is that cool?
Yeah, cool. Totally.
There's a great little exercise at the end of chapter 1 where you can just do a simple breath practice. So it may be that you simply breathe in on 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then breathe out on 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now there's a lovely little bit on the end of that. Imagine a child slide. I'm thinking of your daughter. So imagine a child slide. You're ascending the steps of the slide in little steps like this. In to the top of the slide where you've got maximum in your lungs, and then out, long out, pushing it out. Imagine the end of the slide is long and long and long. People like that because it's we all remember the child slide.
We do, and the visuals are so important. So you went in the pandemic, and this is a big thing for me. I believe that we aren't out, and I would love to call the government out on this, so I'll try not to. But I believe that our children, and I see it, are traumatized. They're
Sure.
traumatized because, particularly my child's age, they were going to school and they'd gone from a world where everybody showed faces to a world where everybody was wearing a face mask. Nobody could be in touch with people. You had to be 2 meters apart. Your school life was topsy-turvy. And this has affected a whole generation, not just us older people who could rationalize it, but a whole generation. And I do hope the government are listening, because there needs to be more support at SEN in schools. But anyway, moving back to that bit where I won't go on a rant, what I'm interested in is, before the pandemic, what were you doing?
Oh,
I know what you're doing.
Well, I've been, in a sense, living quite a simple life until I started to write this book. And then I got involved in social media and all of the things you helped me with, Kirsty. So I've been working one-to-one and sometimes with couples, so it's three of us, but as a psychotherapist for a very long time, since the 90s, and finding sitting alongside folk absolutely amazing, because when people come to see me, they have a problem, that something's not right, something's happened maybe, or they just don't understand why things are the way they are. Life throws all kinds of curveballs at us, doesn't it? But they entrust themselves to me to think with them and enter into a process over time. Sometimes that process is just one session. They share their story, that's enough. But very much more usually, it's a process over time, a few weeks or years. And over the process of psychotherapy, folk learn to trust. And it's a process of deepening trust. But as you deepen that trust, what happens is you go inside, because trauma is an inside story. That was the original title for the book, but the publishers chose the 20 ways. But it's an inside story. So what we do is we go inside to look at what can feel like a tangled ball of wool. Have you ever tried to untangle a ball of wool? That can take ages, can't it? You can have patience of Job. And so what you do together is to pull apart these strands and go, oh, there's this bit. Oh, there's this bit. And you know, when we do that, it always makes sense. I mean, if somebody has dementia or Alzheimer's, that doesn't make sense. But other than that, folk make sense, even if they don't make sense to themselves. With a process of engagement, we make sense, however long it takes. And I've always found that absolutely fascinating and a privilege, and just what I'm meant to do in the world, really. I think one of the things that started it all and was a hallmark of this was being in China in 1989. I was in China teaching English to university students, but that time ended up being historically huge because the government quelled the university students, their hopes and their dreams, and in some cases their lives, when they went in with the tanks at Tiananmen. I wasn't in Beijing, but I was in another city. So the students lost siblings and friends that I knew. So I learned a lot about trauma then, I think. I learned about the power of raw emotions. I learned about the uncertainty of living in a situation where you have no idea what's going to happen from one moment to the next. And I learned about how 4 years, 2 months can feel like 4 years. So although it was only 2 years that I was there, it was a very big influence on my life. But those students, and being with them and being alongside them at that point of trauma, was so life-changing to me. And I kind of felt that that was important, really, to carry on being alongside folk, hence my training as a counsellor and psychotherapist. and going on. And it is only since writing the book, would you believe, and talking about it, that I realized that that Tiananmen experience was so seminal. I mean, that's the thing about trauma. We forget some things that are really important because they are our experience. And that's part of the problem in a way, because we are just the way we are. We trot along the same old paths. But it isn't until we start to examine ourselves and with curiosity think, why do I always think that I have to rescue other people and say yes to everything, for example, and then I nearly end up on my knees? Why is that? Until you start to look at that, you carry on doing the same thing, don't you? It's what you do.
And I love that. It's for me, I had to break the cycle. So I love what you just said there, and how trauma does, and it can lay, as you know, well, you know better than I do, but I know that my own laid hidden for many, many years. But what I want to talk about now is, and I think this is incredible. One, you had an amazing person write the foreword for your book, but two, you've also had somebody else interested in talking about your book. So I wondered if you could talk about Sir Terry Waite, and I think it was Alistair Campbell, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Well, Terry Waite has had a much bigger part than Alistair Campbell. Alistair Campbell is always on a roll. If anybody sees him on the, he's always, but he did read it, and he did say it's an important contribution to the mental health landscape. Important and insightful contribution. So I was delighted with that. And if somebody likes your book, it's like liking your child. I kind of love him forever. But even more, Terry Waite. I mean, Terry Waite, I wrote to him out of the blue. I wrote a persuasive letter about things that he and I might have in common, which looked kind of very persuasive, but it seemed to work. And he has bent over backwards to talk to me about his own trauma and also the good things that have come as a result of trauma. And this is the other aspect, Kirsty, is that the last chapter of the book is called Post-Traumatic Growth. Not so much talked about. We hear about post-traumatic stress, don't we? But post-traumatic growth, people say, what is that? Well, Terry is a great example. Yes, he went through hell. He was chained to a radiator and thought that the captor was going to kill him every morning for 4.5 years with nobody else there. But somehow or other, telling his story, writing it down, being given the privacy that he needed after he came back in 92, he came back to himself. And then he decided, do you know what? Before I was a bit frightened, I was worried about paying my mortgage. After his trauma, he decided, I am going to go and start some charities. I am going to make a difference in the world. I am going to talk about this stuff. And that's what he did. He started 3 charities, one for homelessness, one for hostages, and another Y Care International for the YMCA. International wing of the YMCA. He goes around at 85, speaking, talking, being himself. And what he says is the trauma has given him a distillation. And sometimes I do think it's like a distillation. You go down a funnel. At the top of the funnel, it's all swirling around and too much. You go down the funnel to the distillation point at the bottom of the funnel, and you find out what's most important. And he's done that. He's living his best life. He's also focused on something. And I think that can happen after trauma. It's like you can get rid of the periphery and you can say, this is what I want to do. And also perhaps have a little bit more compassion. Because with trauma, you go through a lot of struggles and it can be very isolating and alone. But you also need to be compassionate with your own struggles. And that compassion can be something post-trauma too. Compassion with yourself so that you keep remembering to tune in. Do the breath practice. Be with you in your own body. Because body is very, very important. We're taken over with this charge, body and mind. So that compassion to self and that focus on what's most important, I think, comes as a result of post-traumatic growth. But it can be very hard to get there. It's sometimes like psychological weight training, you know, that you have to do every day. Don't you like that, Kirsty?
I'm going to put the ticker tape on so that people can see where to get your book from. But actually, post-traumatic growth is what I think I'm in now. You know, let's look at it. I went through a lot of trauma, and just want to touch on it before I think we've had one comment. Is the childhood trauma that child informed? I think it's the first 1,001 days or something. You'll know better than I do, but this is what was when I did my training on a particular subject. We were talking about the first 1,001 days and what happens in utero, and people don't necessarily. And I know there's a whole generation of people who go, "Nothing happened in utero. You were fine." I wondered if we could just lightly touch on childhood trauma and how that could actually lead on to our adult life and inform us.
Yeah. Well, if you're a child, and when we're all children, we are, in simple terms, extraordinarily vulnerable. You know, as humans, we are children for much longer than other mammals. It lasts for ages, doesn't it? And as a parent, you think it lasts a very long time sometimes, right? But the point is, we're very, very vulnerable and we're very raw. So those feelings that we have, that we might feel in trauma, as children, those are all we have in a way until the frontal lobes start to develop in the first year of life. As a very young baby, you're simply like a soup of feelings, and it's all swirling around. So if something isn't safe, or something is intrusive or neglectful, and some terrible things can happen to children in that regard, you of course will feel the impact of that. In terms of how you form your relationships, the relationships help you feel safe. If the relationships aren't there to feel safe, then you will end up feeling unsafe on some level for all of your life. Now, I have a little doll over there, which is a kind of velour doll, but inside, in the back of the doll, are these little parts. And there's a kind of fighty one, there's a fleeing one, and there's a little tiny pink one, which is the child center. And whether we've had childhood trauma or not, and of course we'll be more susceptible to other traumas later in life if we've had childhood trauma. Think of it like dominoes all lined up in a row. One domino hits another and they all go like a stack. But we can, this is the good bit, we can, with the help and the will and the motivation and the curiosity, learn to parent that frightened little child at the core of us. I'm doing it now. Imagining that little child part of me is right there in my chest. And I talk to clients about this. I say, where is that vulnerable, fearful child? Oh, it's a little bit in my chest. I can feel it. I can feel a little pain. Is it a ball? Is it a stirring? Okay, so what happens if we simply focus on that part? Some tears might come, it might bubble up. Or with the right care and attention, the child might feel soothed. So yes, we're more susceptible to trauma if we've had a bad start, and many do. But we can learn to be parents to our inner selves. And I think that's almost the most exciting aspect of what I do with folk.
Thank you. I loved it. So Hayley joined us and she said, I'm buying the book right now. It's a pleasure to watch this episode. Hayley and I, she's a personal friend, and we keep, honestly, every time we talk even more, we find more things and we go, because we're both similar age and we've gone through the 70s, we've got to the 80s, and there was a lot of changes, and parenting changed, and the way we are today. I cannot thank you enough for your time this morning. It has been an absolute pleasure. If you have one piece, I'm going to finish on this, if you could sum up or give a piece of advice to somebody who is listening, because we never know who's going to listen to the podcast, who might not even be aware that they are in a trauma response. They may have been made redundant. They may have just gone through a divorce. They may have some kind of loss. I don't know. But if you could give one piece of advice one golden nugget, although I can imagine there's at least 200 you'd love to share, but what's the first one that comes to mind?
And of course, one bite-sized thing is really hard, but I think if you think of trauma being like too much chili in your soup, we went soup earlier, didn't we? You've got too much chili in your soup. So what can you do? You can't take the chili out, sadly. But what you can do is you can put other stuff in to dissipate it, so it doesn't feel so much chili. So if there's something like that's too much, and that's what trauma is, it's life's been too much for us. See if there's something, some life, some activity, some person, some looking at the sky that helps you discharge what's too much and allow that good thing in. And then the balance, sometimes with trauma, we can feel like a tree that's blown in the wind, one way, the other way. Then we can start to find a bit of balance again by taking in the good thing. Now, that's not easy to do because, as we said before, the trauma will always take us down the same path, and we're convinced about that so often. But one tiny, lovely, good thing that might just go, oh yeah, there's that. In that moment, I might just feel a little bit better. I might just dissipate that charge and feel a bit soothed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. This has been
welcome.
A joyful episode. And I know we're talking about a very heavy topic, but actually the advice and support and everything you've got, I urge people to go and get your book because it really is brilliant. It was a pleasure to work on it. Thank you for your time.
Well, Kirsty, and I should say thank you to you, as I alluded to earlier. My YouTube, I mean, I knew so little about YouTube, I thought it was spelt with a U to start with. I mean, that's how little I knew. But you took it over, went into the back room, and it looked like, the BBC. Or better, if that's the wrong thing to say.
I'm good at window dressing.
Window dressing.
Yeah, I'm good at window dressing.
And you made me, you really did help with all of that. And so I've been so grateful to you for your skills and for your attention on it over the summer. It was quite a summer, wasn't it?
It was my pleasure.
Yeah, and so you've helped get the message out there, Kirsty.
Brilliant.